Hey, what's up everybody? This is Clint and what I have for you in this video, we're going to talk about bubble factors. Um, Bubble factors is an interesting topic that's actually been brought up a lot more recently, but there's not a ton of content on it. It's a topic that was first introduced, I believe it was first introduced, in the book Kill Everyone. Which was a really, really good book. Pretty revolutionary in terms of the topics that it introduced, especially the bubble factors for MTTs and multi-table sit and goes. But one thing that turns off a lot of people when they start talking about bubble factors, and especially as it pertains in that book, it can become pretty intensive in terms of the math involved to doing the calculations for the bubble factor. So what I wanted to do in this video was really break down the bubble factor into its simplest form, get you understanding why you need to consider it, what it is, how you can do your own little modified calculations just based upon some averages, because in game it's not something that you can calculate. What you're going to need to start doing is understanding how the bubble factor changes based upon a few different variables. Your stack size, the pay distribution, your stack size versus the other stacks at the table, so your stack distribution. And as you see here, this little cliche, keep it simple, that's what we're going to do. We want to just keep it simple, talk about how it pertains to your game, and how you can really start using it to make some better decisions. Especially in terms of what ranges you need, specifically as it pertains to calling all in, what type of equity you might need in different situations of different types of games based upon the bubble factor. So you may not even, I'm talking about bubble factors, maybe you don't even know what bubble factors are. The term bubble is in there. It doesn't just pertain to the actual bubble of the game you're playing. It's essentially a term used to actually give a number to ICM. And specifically, it's a ratio. It's a ratio of the cost of losing versus the gain of winning. And that number is always greater than 1 due to the fact that there's a prize pool. In a cash game, you bet $1, you win $1. Your dollar chip is worth $1. So there is no bubble factor because there is no prize pool. Because there's the prize pool, as soon as the first hand is dealt of a tournament, there's a value to your chips that is not an exact one-to-one value. That because you're not in the money yet, and as you approach the money, the value of your chips will gradually start increasing. So essentially, the value, the cost of losing chips is worth more than the gain of winning them, and that number, that ratio, will gradually start increasing. So it always starts more than 1. If you were to make the cost of losing versus the gain of ratio fraction. The cost of losing versus the gain of winning. Now, depending on the type of game, will depend on how big of a ratio that ends up being. But again, the closer you get to the money, the cost of losing does get higher. And we'll break it down in terms of depending on stack size, the different types of games, how that will affect your decision making. But again, it gives a number to ICM. If you're used to using ICM calculators like Sit and Go Wizard, you understand that it does all the calculations kind of behind the scenes, and you put in the ranges, you put in the situation, and it'll spit out this decision was plus 0.2% plus EV, or negative 0.2% EV, so a negative EV play. And accordingly will give you ranges to determine you make a long run play. Well, what the bubble factor does is gives you a specific number that you can apply to a very specific situation to know what type of equity is needed to justify a certain call. It can be applied to not just calling situations. It's probably where it's more commonly used in calling situations where you have no fold equity, someone shoves all in, you've got some pot odds. You need to determine with what range of hands will justify a profitable call. What equity is needed. And there's an ICM tax in there, and this bubble factor will help you understand that cushion or ICM tax that you need. And again, the bubble factor as it applies to stack sizes, the bigger your stack. I mean, just think about it, guys. If you're approaching the bubble and you're the big stack, the bigger your stack, the more you potentially have to lose. So the higher your bubble factor is. That bubble factor will help you determine how much it sucks to lose, essentially. That's what that ratio is. How much it sucks to lose versus the gain of winning. The more chips you have, the more it sucks to lose. And because if you're on the bubble with 20 big blinds, that's much different than losing with 5 big blinds. You have much more to lose with the bigger stack than you do with a 5 big blind stack. But accordingly, you have to compare your stack to the other stacks at the table, and that will really change things. But what we need to do is we need to have a starting point, a basis, and then from that basis, we can adjust the bubble factor up and down based upon several key factors, which we'll get into. So what I'm about to show you next is, and it may not make a lot of sense right away, is what I'm going to show you are the bubble factors at different stages of the game based upon how many players are left, and what those actual number values are, what they mean, and then we'll get into how to actually use those numbers. So as I'm going through these numbers, I'm not going to do a lot of calculations, just going through them. It may be a part of the video you're going to want to pause or revisit to look at the different averages and numbers. But they're important to look at to more understand the trend and what the bubble factor means for the different types of games. So what I have here, it says in the title, the pre-final table bubble factor. So we're not at the final table yet. The bubble factor, as I said, is a number that's given to ICM. Now, ICM is typically calculated at the final table when you know all the players that are left in the game and the value, their stacks, so therefore you can get an accurate calculation of the value of your chips. So in a 9-man game, that's your final table. You know all the players, you know all the stack sizes. You can get a good calculation of what the value of each chip is. As you get to 18-mans, 27-mans, all the way to 180-mans, you're dealing with multiple tables. You don't know everybody else at the other tables. You usually can't do calculations. But what the bubble factor can do is give you an idea of how much consideration you need to give to ICM as you're going through the game, approaching the money. Now, before I get into these numbers, the date of this video right now is February 11th, 2013. As of this morning, I heard that PokerStars had actually changed their payout distribution. 90-mans are now paying 13 players, and 180-mans are now paying, instead of paying 18 players, they're paying 27. This chart, these numbers, this presentation I put together was based upon what the payouts were yesterday. But that's okay. It's really not going to change much. The numbers might be slightly different, but it's not going to change much in terms of your overall gameplay or plan for that particular game at the different stages. It's really not going to change a whole lot because the top payout spots weren't really changed. For example, 180-mans are still very top heavy, so accordingly the bubble factor will reflect that. So as I go through here, I'm going to talk as if the 180-mans and the 90-mans were like they were yesterday, with 12 pay spots and 18 pay spots respectively. So I'm going to talk about that, but understand when I go through these numbers, don't think that, well, what is it now? It's not going to be a lot different. Same concepts will apply. So as you'll see here in the first column, we got hand number 1. So right when you start the first game, or I'm sorry, the first hand of your game, how much ICM do we need to consider, take into consideration? In a 9-man, your ratio is 1.2. So if you were to go all in the first hand, it would suck 1.2 times as much to lose that hand than it would be to win that hand. I'm going to get into a calculation after I go through these numbers about what that actually means, and we're going to give actual equity percentages. I think everybody's very more comfortable in talking about I need 40% equity or 50% equity to justify a call based upon pot odds. This bubble factor is then going to be kind of injected into the pot odds calculation to give you a real equity percent that we need. So I'll get into that, but again, I want to point out what the bubble factors are, what the trends are for each game. So as a 180 or in a 9-man, 1.2 to start, As you start adding in more players, so you get an 18-man, a 27-man, a 45-man, because you're essentially further away from the money, you need to consider ICM a whole lot less. Now in an 18-man, you have 2 tables, so 1.13. All the way down to the 180-mans, where it's 1.03. About as close as 1 as you can get. Because we have so long to go to get to the money, we don't really need to consider ICM or the value of your chips. You're essentially in chip EV mode. So you're going to be making decisions based upon what puts chips in your stack versus the actual value of your stack, the dollar value of your stack. Okay? Now, you'll see I have 2 blocks here in red. What those illustrate is the actual bubble factor on the bubble of those games. So as you can see here, as you're approaching the bubble, and let's take a PokerStars 90-man game. The first hand, your bubble factor is 1.06, doesn't mean a whole lot. As you get to 19, 18, 15, 14, and as you can see I skipped a couple of players, we don't need to see every progression. But as you start progressing to get to that actual bubble, which is on when there's 13 players left and there's 12 pay spots, 13 is your bubble. As you can see, as you get closer to that bubble, your bubble factor is increasing on average. And when I say on average, what I mean is these numbers are based upon everybody at the table having the exact same stack. Okay, I know that that's not what happens. There's always a big stack, a medium stack, a small stack. But we have to start, again, like I said, at a basis. So if everybody has equal stacks, based upon the payouts and the pay distribution of that game, what's our bubble factor? How much ICM do we need to consider? How important is that next pay jump? The more important a pay jump is, like for example in a bubble, you go from making $0 to making whatever that next pay jump is. The steeper that pay jump, the more you have to essentially risk or lose to get to that next spot. The more important it is to get to that next spot. So your bubble factor will reflect that. Versus, let's say, and I'll jump ahead real quick to a 180-man. A 180-man is very top-heavy. So you don't have a lot of big pay jumps in between, but you have some big pay jumps in the top 3 spots. So once you get into the money, your goal really is to get to those top spots. Therefore, we don't need to give as much consideration to ICM. There's not as much of an ICM tax. So on a 90-man game, on the 90-man bubble, it hurts us 1.85 times as much to lose that hand than it would be to win. So you need to take that into consideration if you're thinking about calling it all in, for example. It's not just, you can't just say, well, am I ahead of his range? You have to factor in this bubble factor. And again, I'll get into how that 1.85, what that actually means. And as you can see on the bubble of a 180-man, it's 1.53. So 2 bubbles, but the bubble of a 180-man is significantly less. So therefore, we won't need as much of an equity cushion. There isn't as much pain when we lose because we know our ultimate goal in a 180-man is to get to those top spots. So the bubble factor reflects that. Now, for a 180-man, you can see that your bubble factor will rise to about 1.53 on the actual bubble, but then look, it drops back down 1.19, 1.26, 1.29. Why is that? Well, if you play 180-mans, you know that you go from making 0 to the pay jump of the bubble breaks, and then your payout is flat. I believe it's 1.2. So no matter whether you finished in 18th or 11th, the pay is exactly the same. So there's not a lot of reward for getting to the next pay spot, and your bubble factor reflects that. It's not a big deal if you finish in 16th or 15th. But there is a pay jump from getting from the 10th spot to get into the final table of the having 9 players left. And because there's that next pay jump, it's almost like you have another bubble when you have 10 players left in a 180-man game, because you can see it starts increasing a little bit, but it drops down. Then you get to 1.52. It's almost exactly the same as the money bubble at the final table. So that's again where you need to give consideration that there's actually some value to that final table bubble and making that final table, and your ranges need to reflect that. Okay. Now, this is pre-final table, typically taken into more consideration for the 180 mans, the 90 mans, even the 45 mans. Let's get to what these bubble factors start doing when we get to the final table. And as you can see here, we have the actual bubbles of the 9 and 18, 27, and 45 man games. So what this will show here, if we just follow these red blocks, the bubble of a 9 man, four-handed, 1.88. The bubble of an 18 man, again, if you think about the 18 man payouts, it's a flat payout. 40, 30, 20, 10 in terms of the payout. So there's not as much reward for the next pay jump. So accordingly, your bubble factor will reflect that. Okay, 27 man, very similar. Now the 45 man, the PokerStars 45 man, I find is actually one of those games that a lot of people have some misconceptions about in terms of how you should play it. Because it's a 45 man and it's a bigger multi-table sit and go than your typical 1 or 2 table games, they think that, well, you need to play for first because that's where you make all your money. Of course, first is important, but it's more important of understanding what the pay distribution is. It's actually relatively flat, a 45 man, a PokerStars 45 man game. And because it's relatively flat, the PokerStars 45 man sit and go has the highest average bubble factor of any sit and go outside of a double or nothing. I didn't include double or nothings in here, but as you can imagine, the bubble of a double or nothing would be gigantic because there are no pay jumps. It's pretty much a winner take all. But in the PokerStars 45 man, the bubble is actually extremely, extremely important, and it's actually greater than 2. And again, I'll show you what that means in a second. But just have that in the back of your mind that the bubble of a 45 man on PokerStars, because of the flat payout, we need to take into consideration big time when you're on that actual bubble. On a full tilt 45 man, a little bit more top heavy, one less pay spot, so accordingly the bubble is a little bit less. And the full tilt pays out 9 players on their 90 mans, and you can see their pay spots, the bubble factors there. So again, I'm not going to go through every single number. It's more important that you understand what the bubble factor means on a whole, how it changes, and it's a good idea to really just kind of memorize what the bubble factors are on the actual bubble of the games, and especially in the money. So it's important to understand that if you're on a 45 man bubble in PokerStars, your average bubble factor is over 2. It's important to understand in a 180 man, it's a lot less. It's 1.5, so not as much consideration. So that's why I wanted to show this chart. Pause it, copy it, do whatever you want. These numbers came from bubble factor calculators. There's a lot of them out there for free. You can just throw the different games, the payouts, and you can see how the bubble factors change. And that'll be really good. I definitely recommend getting a bubble factor calculator so that you can put in specific stacks and see how your bubble factor changes. So, with that being said, how can we use these actual numbers? How do these numbers get calculated? So, what I want to do is a quick calculation and then talk to you about what these numbers actually mean. Alright, so this looks like a mess right now, but there's a quick and easy way to calculate bubble factors. And what you need to do is, you'll see up here, and I'll just highlight it. And the reason I put this in presentation mode because I want to be clicking around, and it's not as easy to do in a presentation. So you want to take your pot odds divided by your bubble factor at that particular stage, and that's going to give you X. That's going to give you a number. And then what you're going to do is 1 divided by 1 plus the number that we got here, and that's going to give you your equity needed. Okay? So let's just jump forward to what that actually means here. So as an example, let's say it's the first hand of a 9-man game. And if you remember, what did we say about the first hand of a 9-man? The bubble factor is about 1.2. Okay, right here. So if we take the first hand of a 9-man, 1.2, and let's just say someone shoves all in. So you're getting 1-to-1 pot odds essentially. So what we need to do is figure out, you can't just figure out, you need to have a guaranteed equity to justify a call here based upon the ICM. So how much equity do we actually need to make a profitable call here if we were contemplating calling an all-in in the first hand of a 9-man sit and go? So we take this calculation. The odds are 1. We're getting 1 to 1. So 1 divided by the bubble factor of 1.2 gives us 0.833333. Then we take 1 divided by 1 plus 0.83333, and we get 54.5, so roughly about 55% equity. So I'm going to do a calculation what that means with ace-king, but essentially you need about a guaranteed 55% equity to justify an all-in call on the first hand. Somebody just opened ships all in, and you're trying to figure out with what range of hands. Well, based upon your opponent's range, you put that in, you figure out what gives you about 55% equity. Okay? Hold that thought. We're going to get to that, an example of that in a second. But here's where bubble factors and equity, we could start getting a relationship between the two. So as I said, if your bubble factor is 1, that's a cash game. 1 to 1, 50. A coin flip is a coin flip. Because we have prize pools and bubbles and pay jumps, our bubble factor is going to increase, and our equity needed is going to increase as well. So, for example, let's take a PokerStars 45-man, a bubble factor of 2.1. So let's say in a situation and you realize you have a 2.1 average bubble factor. That means to justify a call, if you look back and you call with a certain hand and you say, you know what, based upon his range, should this have been a call? If you put in, maybe you have a bubble factor calculator, you figure out your bubble factor is 2.1, you need about 68% equity to justify a call, a guaranteed 60% equity to justify a call. Whereas if you're on the bubble of a 180 man, which we said was roughly 1.5, you need only about 60% equity to justify a call. So that's the relationship between the bubble factor and equity, is that as your bubble factor increases, typically as you're getting closer to the money, you need to be a little bit more careful because you need to be significantly more ahead of your opponent's range as that bubble factor increases. And this will give that relationship of how far ahead of our opponent's range or with what kind of equity we need to justify. Now, as I said, to get these numbers, all these numbers, this was based upon the average bubble factor, meaning everybody has the same exact stacks. Well, what happens when people don't have the same exact stacks? Here's a chart that looks very familiar to what, if you read Kill Everyone, is very familiar to what's in that book. But it essentially gives the relationship between now your stacks. So here we talked about, we talked a lot in here about the actual pay jumps and how the pay will affect, the flat payout or a higher, a more top-heavy payout, how that will affect your bubble factor. A more top-heavy, your bubble factor will be lower as you approach the money. A flatter payout, you're going to have a higher bubble factor. So here, now let's start factoring in stack sizes. So as I said before, if you have a big stack, you have more to lose. So if you're in a big stack versus big stack confrontation, your bubble factor is extremely, extremely high because you have a lot to lose there. And you essentially want to avoid those confrontations, especially if you're on the calling end of things. Many times, for example, if you're ever doing ICM calculations, put in this, for example. Go onto a bubble, give everybody the same exact stacks, or give two stacks, give two players big stacks, and have one player shove into you and you hold ace-king. Many times, folding ace-king on the bubble of a 9-man is necessary. Whereas that's probably one of the biggest mistakes I see people do is, they call with ace-king on the bubble of a 9-man or even an 18-man when they shouldn't be, because of these types of confrontations, big stack versus big stack, and even medium stack versus medium stack. You don't want to essentially be on the receiving end and calling. Because of these factors, you can do more of the attacking. If we switch positions here, and you have a potential to shove into another big stack or exploit these bubble factors because you know they can't call based upon the equity that's needed that we figured out here. So, for example, if we're on a bubble of a 45 man where it's 2.1 on average, let's say we're two really big stacks, number one and number two at the table. Number one stack number one shoves into stack number two. His bubble factor is going to be way higher than 2.1. Even without doing the calculation, I don't need to know that it's probably 3 or even 4, depending on even if there's other shorter stacks at the table. So you need to be careful in that sense. But if you flip, do a reversal, you want to be the one doing the attacking and being aggressive, taking advantage of these relationships and bubble factor relationships. The medium stack versus medium stack is typically the more common scenario you're going to face, especially on the bubble or approaching the bubble. A 10 big blind versus 10 big blind situation. So both of these scenarios here can result in very high bubble factors because if you lose those hands, you might get knocked out, or most likely you're knocked out or close to it. So you give up all your equity in that game, potentially unnecessarily. So now let's take a look at the flip side. Let's say you're the big stack versus some medium or small stacks. The medium or small stacks have a lot more to lose because if they lose against you, they're out. If you lose against them, you're probably not out. So your bubble factor is low, theirs is high, you want to be on the attack. And in general, when you're a smaller stack, your bubble factor is going to be lower because you have less to lose. You still want to be attacking other similar stacks because their bubble factor against you is high as well. Whenever you're equal in stack to somebody, that's where typically the higher bubble factors will come into play. So I hope that's making sense in terms of the relationship and about how the bubble factor, we can give a number now to ICM and how much consideration we need to give to ICM and what that means for our ranges as we're progressing through through the different stages of the games. So here's a quick example of the bubble factor, ICM, and Ace King, and in the first hand of a game, like I mentioned before. So let's take you have Ace King in a 9-man game, an opponent 3-bet shoves you all in. As we said, the bubble factor with 9 players is about 1.2, so it hurts 1.2 times as much to lose. So as I mentioned, if we go back to here, the bubble factor is 1.2. The equity needed is about 55%. So if we are holding Ace King, we need to be sure that we have about a 55% equity against our opponent's range to justify an all-in. So what's 55%? So here's something I just copied from Pokersavvy. If we look here, typically in the early stages of a game, most people know not to go all in too lightly. So let's say somebody shoves all in on you with pocket tens and ace queen at the worst, which is, even ace queen's pretty wide, but let's just give him ace queen for the time being. You can see versus that range that ace king is not doing very well. It's only got 49% equity versus that range. So if we take this scenario, you don't want to be calling it all in because we need 55%. So what kind of range would justify calling it all in with ace king in the early game? Well, typically the player will have to be pretty crazy, but there are those players like that that are willing to get it all in with anything in the early game. So if you look here, you can see that pocket eights, ace jack, even king queen suited. If our opponents, we could put them on that type of range, then our equity is going to be around 55%. So if you hold ace king and you're faced with an all-in, you need to be damn sure that your opponent is this, close to being this wide to justify going all in. If you're not sure, it's actually better to fold. So in the early stage of a 9-man, most likely I'm folding ace king in an all-in scenario unless I know for a fact that this guy is just insane and is willing to just click buttons and get it all in. And again, you can apply this is how this concept is applied, and you can apply that to all stages of the game. Because this is how ace king, or sorry, this is how our ranges are affected by the bubble factor of different games. So as I mentioned, you can't calculate in game. There's too many calculations to do. So what you need to do is understand the averages. Again, print out that chart that I made. Memorize what the bubbles are for the different games, or specifically the game that you're playing, and how those averages will fluctuate based upon the stack size. So if you're in a big stack versus big stack battle on the bubble, and let's say there's another short stack there, because of that disproportionate stack distribution, you're giving up a lot of equity potentially, so you need to be damn sure that you have enough equity to justify that ICM tax, essentially. The bubble factor being that ICM tax. Then there's the question of, when can we ignore this? We talk sometimes about negative EV situations or when ICM doesn't matter. As I mentioned, like the beginning stages of those big multi-table games, the 180 mans, the 45 mans, the 90 mans, you're in chip EV scenarios. So you're far away from the pay spots. You're making decisions that will just put chips in your stack. The chips don't really have a whole lot of value at this point. So we're not looking for the dollar value. We're just looking for pure chip value. So that's where we can kind of ignore the ICM aspect. But also, more importantly, our future scenarios is where we can start ignoring the ICM and bubble factors. Two main future scenarios. One is, ICM and bubble factors as a whole take into consideration your situation as it's presented to you. Especially if you're playing with like Sit and Go Wizard, it doesn't know that the blinds are about to hit you, or if you look in your info box that in less than 1 minute the blinds are about to go up. That's the time where you can ignore ICM, take the negative EV shove to preserve future equity. Okay, I'm not going to get into what range you should do that with or how much you should change, but that's a time where you can start ignoring or taking more negative EV spots to help preserve future equity based upon what's about to happen. Whether the blinds are about to hit you, the blinds are about to go up. So that's one situation to potentially ignore ICM. Another situation is having the big stack advantage. You know that when you're on the big stack, when you're the big stack on the bubble or even in the money, you have a huge advantage over the other opponents, and that advantage is because intuitively, whether they know it or not, they know ICM and bubble factors. They know that if they get knocked out, they're missing that potential to make the money or move up another pay spot. So, some of the more recreational random players may not understand that fully, but especially if you're up against regs, they know that. And they know what ranges they should be calling with, especially if they're facing a call from the big stack. So as the big stack, you can exploit the bubble. You can exploit the bubble factor to put yourself in great position to pick up a massive stack that will allow you to finish in first place more. So what that means is there's times where you can even take slightly negative EV spots if winning that hand means that it puts you into a new category of chips that will allow you to do things you otherwise couldn't have done to give you a better opportunity to come in first place. Okay? That this is more of a subjective play. There's no specific calculation for it. It's more of an understanding, and don't I see sometimes people use this as an excuse. Well, I called there because if I win, I have a really big stack and I can, I can abuse the bubble. There has to be a balance. You can't get too out of control with it. Usually I like this scenario where, let's say you're contemplating calling it all in, where you lose the hand, you're still in the game and have an okay stack, but if you win the hand, you have the clear chip lead. That's typically where I'll justify maybe making a marginal call that maybe isn't justified by the bubble factor or ICM, but can give me a huge future advantage in the game. Okay? That comes more with intuition, instinct, and understanding your ability and your advantage over the table. Okay? So, the conclusion of all this bubble factor conversation, you want to understand the differences between each game type and essentially understand the averages. So go back to those charts, understand what the averages are, and know how to adjust. If you're in a big stack versus big stack battle, your bubble factor is much higher. If you're in a more top-heavy structure, like a 180 man, your bubble factor is typically lower because it's more imperative for you to get in those top spots. So there's not as much of a dollar value consideration on your chips. And the stack distribution. If you have a very short stack there, one big blind stack, for example, it's going to be pretty easy to get to the next pay spot. So you don't want to put your stack at an unnecessary risk when you know you're going to be moving up pretty easily. Okay, you're giving up a lot of equity there. So you're never going to know this 100% in the game. It's just best to know averages and how it affects you. One other thing I like to point out that I didn't put in here are MTTs. If any MTT guys are watching this, I know I'm more of a sit and go guy, but you'll be surprised. MTTs actually have a relatively flat pay structure, and there's much more ICM, especially as you approach the final table, than most people think. So it's something to take a look at if you're an MTT guy and you don't think there's any ICM involved. The bubble factor is actually pretty similar, I believe, to the 180 mans. While it's still top heavy, it's a little bit more flatter than you think. So that's the conclusion, for giving a kind of a 30,000 foot view of the bubble factors. Hopefully, breaking it down into simpler form. I want to make a part 2 to this as well, where I go through specific examples of hand history examples where you're in specific scenarios, and if you're on the bubble of a 9-man and you have, let's say, a pocket pair, for example, what your equity needs to be to justify a call, and a 9-man, an 18-man, a 45-man, and understanding how, faced with the exact same hand, the exact same situation, how your ranges should differ, and how sometimes you should call and how sometimes you should call, or how sometimes you should fold, excuse me, based upon the bubble factor in that game. So that's next on the docket. I'll have specific hand history examples to explain this even further, but hopefully you got a good view of, if you were confused about the bubble factors, you think it's very math intensive, doesn't have to be. The chart's there for you to get an average, understand whether those averages go up or down based upon these factors. So good luck at the tables, guys. Hopefully I didn't confuse you even more with this bubble factor conversation, but it's very important for you to understand how that should change your decision making ability depending on what game you're playing. So good luck, guys. Hope you enjoyed.